Good afternoon and welcome to the Low Carbon Forum. ADB is very privileged to co-host with this forum with the Hunan government. I will be talking about the significance of international cooperation to deal with climate change. I will also try to draw a parallel with the COVID crisis that the world is facing today. And there are lessons to be learned from here. So we have really a tale of two global crises. One is the global COVID-19 pandemic, and the other is the climate change crisis. The global COVID pandemic was a real shock to the entire world. It killed millions of people and it impacted billions. Similarly, the climate change crisis, it's changing the world. It's impacting not only human beings, but almost all species. A small difference, in some areas, this is a gradual impact, which may be more dangerous because it's irreversible. And we are already seeing some sudden impacts which are causing a lot of death and destruction via extreme and catastrophic climate events and other events like forest fires, floods, etc. So it's very important to deal with this impending and actually something which we are already in the midst of climate change crisis and draw lessons from how the world has faced the COVID-19 pandemic. If we look at the climate crisis in the last 200, less than 200 years, we find that global temperatures have risen very steeply. And in the last few decades, these temperature increases have been spectacular. The impact of these high temperatures is manifested in hydrological events such as floods, mass movements, in climate events like extreme temperature, droughts, and forest fire. So if we see the graph on the right, we find that in less than 40 years, the climate events like extreme temperature and drought have almost doubled, and hydrological events like floods and mass movements have increased more than 4 times. So this just shows the enormity of the problem. Now, how do we fight a crisis? In my view, we need to do two things. One, we have to be clever, we have to be creative, and we have to innovate to deal with the challenges that a crisis puts in front of us. But also, the second thing that we need to do is to coordinate and collaborate. Without coordination and collaboration, we cannot solve a global crisis. And I like this picture on the right, which shows the collaboration and coordination amongst these young men to save a life. So when innovation was applied to vaccine development against COVID, this was, I would say, an extreme innovation. In less than 1 year, the vaccine was developed and put into the arms of people. And the impact of this is evident from these two graphs. We see on the left-hand side graph, the dark blue line is for people aged over 85 years. And the pink line is for younger people, 18 to 49. And we find that without the vaccination, the rate of hospitalization for those aged 85 and above was much higher than for those in the younger age group. But after vaccination, when say 10% of the elderly were vaccinated, we see in the graph on the right that the rate of hospitalization declined faster for the old people compared to the younger generation. So the vaccine actually saved millions of lives. And for climate change also, we need to have similar innovation and global collaboration. If we look at the climate change technologies or climate safe technologies, and if we measure this looking at the patent activity worldwide in environmental technologies, we find that human ingenuity and technological progress can help us to slow down climate change. So we see wind power, solar photovoltaics, patents increasing, and it's evident also in the real world with costs coming down for these technologies and these being really uh, technologies that are helping us mitigate climate change. So it is very, very important that we continue to invest in these new technologies and business models to fight the climate change crisis. All this technology and knowledge gets multiplied manifold if there is cooperation and collaboration and sharing of this information and a transfer of technology. This graph illustrates the international collaboration in wind power technologies in its initial years. And as you can see that there was a lot of collaboration between the developed countries, but also between the developed and developing countries. So this is very essential. So you can have innovation and technological advancement, but cooperation and collaboration or global collaboration increases the effectiveness and efficiency of these solutions, especially when we are looking at a global crisis. Now, if one looks at the evolution of international cooperation, less than half a century ago, maybe when ADB had just been formed, cooperation or transfer of knowledge and technology was from the developed countries to developing countries, or what was called North-South cooperation. But subsequently, there was also collaboration and cooperation between developing countries. And there was the South-South cooperation. Developing countries were able to learn from each other. And a newer stage is where even developing countries are contributing to evolution and international cooperation to developed countries. So now there is a triangular innovation that's taking place between developing countries, developed and developing countries, and developing and developed countries. And in this, the multilateral development banks like the Asian Development Bank have a role to play. They need to facilitate this process and can do this and are doing it. So let me show what the multilateral development banks have done to support the climate change efforts. So this graph shows the climate finance commitments over the last 5-6 years by World Bank, Islamic Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, EIB, BRD, AIIB, ADB, and the African Development Bank. And we find that climate finance has been increasing and reached almost 43 billion in 1 year in 2018. Subsequently, it has declined and it went down to 38 billion in 2020, and this was because the MDB resources were diverted towards fighting the challenges of COVID. And if we see where these climate finance resources from from the MDBs have gone, we find that developing Asia is responsible for consuming 42% of the MDB financing. So going forward, development partners and MDBs play a major role to facilitate international cooperation. And they do have the knowledge and resources. They have knowledge from a wide spectrum of countries, which can be shared with other countries. And they have the resources to support this knowledge transfer, financing of innovative technologies, adapting and building resilience to climate change, transfer of knowledge and technology, and most importantly, strengthening the institutional capacity of those organizations that are responsible for mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change. And we have to bear in mind that climate change is a threat to the world that is all pervasive, and we need to go all out to combat this, and we need a multi-dimensional approach. So we would need technological, environmental, geophysical, institutional, economic, and social measures to combat the challenge of climate change. And ADB is committed to fight this challenge. We have committed 80 billion over the period 2019 to 2030 as climate finance using our own resources. And we have furthered this ambition to 100 billion over the same period. So with ADB and other multilateral development banks, we lend our full support to fighting the challenge of climate change. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention and wish you all very fruitful discussions. Thank you.